When you start to lead, I guarantee you at some point in your leadership, you will be criticized. So how do you handle that? What does that look like? Is it important? Should you pay attention to it? These are questions we're going to answer today. That's why today's topic is handling criticism. Welcome back to the Spirit-Filled Leadership Podcast. I'm Pete Brack. Miguel's behind the the camera is what it's called. And today we're talking about handling criticism. And as I said in the opener, when you lead anything, whether it's your family, whether it's an organization, a ministry, at some point, when you step out in leadership and say, I think this is where we need to go, when you model a behavior that you want other people to follow, when you make a decision, there's going to be people who disagree. And there's going to be people who voice that disagreement, oftentimes because we live in a fallen world with broken people who, shockingly enough, have strong opinions about things. Will maybe even voice that criticism, voice that disagreement in a way that's hurtful, a way that's painful, a way that's maybe not even very holy, you know? And I don't think I need to go on because I think you all understand that criticism is part of this human experience. When you live with other human beings and try to interact with other human beings and we try to build something together or do anything together, there are going to be times of disagreement, and there's going to be times when somebody is looking at somebody else and saying, you shouldn't have done this, this isn't right, you're not good at this, some sort of often harsh, often painful, often personal criticism. And I want to make a distinction here between, and we can maybe do a different podcast on this. I'm not so much talking about the persecution that Jesus foretells for his disciples, right? There's multiple times throughout the Gospels where Jesus says, as you follow me, they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. They're going to drag you before tribunals, all because of my name. He even closes Beatitudes by, blessed are those when you're persecuted for my sake. So there's a way at which like persecution for the gospel is slightly different than what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is more of the everyday leadership moments where you're trying to do the right thing. We're not talking about scandal. We're not talking about sinful behavior. That's not criticism. That's necessary change. That's like necessary reform that needs to happen. I'm not talking about the very valid, like, hey, we're looking at something and that's wrong, like objectively wrong, and we need to do something about that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really the times when there's a strategic difference where somebody thinks we should do this and you think we should do something else and you're criticized for it. Or a belief difference, right? I believe in this, and I'm going to criticize your belief system. So both of those circumstances are just very different than scandal or genuine wrongdoing, or even the persecution that Jesus foretells for his disciples. So we're focusing more on that kind of everyday criticism, that as a leader, how do I navigate the reality of I'm trying to do the right thing and it's being misinterpreted, it's being misconstrued, or people just flat out don't like what I'm doing and they're vocalizing it. What do we do about that? So when criticism arises, it's really important to notice three parts of the criticism: the source, the matter, and the resolution. So what do I mean by that? The source, who's it coming from? The matter, what are they actually saying? And this is a key one and we'll break down each one of these. The matter is really important because a lot of times what we think is being said is not always what is being said. And so really diving into what is the actual critique is very important. And then finally, the resolution. What is being proposed, or what does someone want to have happen about it? Like the now what? Okay, so this is what you're critiquing, but now what? What are we supposed to do about it? Or what would you like us to do about it? Or how would what would be done to resolve the critique? Okay, so the source. When you're a leader and you start to experience criticism, you start to experience pushback, it's very important to evaluate the source. Are you hearing it directly from the person, or are you hearing it from someone else? Is it in writing? Is it a comment on a Facebook group? Is it a news article? Like, what is the source? Diving down into it is what is the heart, and not just like the source is, but ideally trying to determine the primary source. Who is the aggrieved party? Who is the person at the center of this kind of eruption of criticism? Because then when you start to know where the source, you can start to evaluate whether or not the source is credible, whether the source is coming from a place of love or of hatred. The source is kind of willing the good of you and whatever you're leading, or trying to work in counteract of it. To know the source allows for so many different ways to actually have a circumspective view of it, so that we're not just getting hit with the criticism and immediately focusing on what the criticism says. That's important. We're going to talk about that next. But knowing where the criticism is coming from is vitally important first. So once you've identified the source, then you can start to and have evaluated the source and kind of determine the validity and the complexity and the nuance of what the source is after. Then you can identify the matter. What are they actually critiquing? What is the meat of the substance of the critique? And a lot of times this is really nuanced too, because sometimes you're hearing secondhand a thing, or you've heard whispers of this or whispers of that, and sometimes it can be difficult to say, like, no, what is the actual problem? And when you dive into the actual problem, my recommendation is that you try as best as possible to distinguish between the emotion associated with the problem and the actual problem itself. Okay. So chances are, if somebody is taking the time and using the energy to critique your leadership, there's some emotion tied up into it. Understandably so. So to be able to determine, as the problem as I receive the critique and I look at what the critique is actually saying, what part of the critique is really just driven by the emotion of the moment, and how do I kind of separate that from the core of what they're getting at? I've experienced this before in leadership here around Renewal Ministries, where I've at different times within my team had issues where there was a critique of my participation in a particular event, or better yet, my lack of participation in a particular event. And it was a valid critique. It was from a good source. It was from one of my team members. And the critique was, you said you were going to do this and you didn't do it. In the receiving of that criticism, what became clear was there was a lot of emotion tied into that. That was valid. I understand where the emotion was coming from, but that wasn't so much the matter of the problem. The problem was, Pete, you said you were going to do this and then you didn't do it. Or you didn't do it in the way that I expect you to do it, or the fullness of what you said you were going to do. Which allowed then to receive the emotion, but not let the emotion be the one driving the next stage, which is the resolution. Allowing the emotion to be understood and validated insofar as it's worth validating, but not letting it kind of drive the ship. Not letting emotions govern the entire thing. Which leads to the third thing, which is the resolution. The question as a leader, now what? And with any criticism, there's a variety of options as to what the now what is. Sometimes the now what is to ignore it. You've reviewed the source, you've identified and looked at the matter of the critique and determined it's not worth responding to. It's not valid. It's not true. It's not right. So one conceivable option is to ignore it. Another conceivable option is to address it head on. Another conceivable option is to address part of it, the part that's valid, and ignore the rest. There's so many different ways that the now what can be put into practice. But the now what always comes after identifying, evaluating the source, looking at the matter and separating it from the emotion, and then being able to have a reasoned, wise, hopefully prayerful understanding of what should we do now. So it goes source, matter, resolution. So how do we do this? 3 tips. The first one is not going to surprise you. Whenever critique comes your way, the first posture is to pray, to get down on your knees and to say, Lord, I'm yours. I only want to do what you want me to do. I only want to think what you want me to think. I only want to say what you want me to say. I am yours, Lord, fully. My aim is to please you. I said that very strangely. My aim is to please you, not anyone else, not the board, not my boss, nobody else. First and foremost, I am trying to please you, Lord Jesus. And then I'm aiming to please and honor the people that you've put in my life, certainly, but it starts with him. And the ability to weather the storm of criticism is often tied directly to the intimacy that you have with the Lord in those times. The ability to preserve inner peace, the ability to act with wisdom, the ability to act with kindness and patience, The ability to then see the path of righteousness and have the courage to walk down it comes from your time in intimate relationship with the Lord. So the first tip is pray. Second tip is to consult. Who are the trusted people in your life that you can bring the source, the matter, and the now what, the resolution to, and say, what do you think of this? Help me understand this. Let's unpack this together. I'm receiving this from somebody else. What do you think? This is what I'm thinking about it. What do you think about it? To be able to be humble enough to say that the answers and the understanding and the perspective on any sort of criticism generally is probably not confined just to your own brain, just to your own emotions, just to your own insights. Generally speaking, the wisdom and the understanding and the kind of framework as to how to move forward is going to come from a combination of yourself and what God has done in you and what God has done in the people that you trust around you. So pray, consult, and then finally, engage in it. Do something. Even if that something is to do nothing, at least choose to do nothing. The worst thing to do with criticism is to not really ever make an intentional decision about it. In the sense of, sometimes if we just try to like passively ignore it when we know something's come up, when we're being criticized, when there's conflict, it just festers. It'll fester in your own heart. It'll fester in the people you're leading. It'll fester in the people that are aware but are wondering why you're not doing something about it. So just engage, to decide to say, no, this is the plan of action. Sometimes that plan of action will be the correct one, and sometimes it won't. And if it's not, we've talked about it on the podcast before, then apologize and move on and make a better decision and identify it and be transparent about what worked and didn't work. That's part of leadership too. You're not always going to make the right decision when you're dealing with criticism, but make a decision. Choose to say, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to handle this. Everybody sound good? This work? Yep, let's go. So we need to pray about it. We need to consult. And then we need to engage. We need to make a decision about how we're going to move forward. Criticism is inevitable. It's part of the human experience, and it's definitely part of leadership. And it hurts. It's not fun. I don't think I know anyone in my life who like enjoys being criticized. I don't think I know anyone in my life who'd be like, yeah, you know what I like a lot is when people don't like what I'm doing or don't like my decisions. You can learn to thrive through them. You can learn to still be who you need to be, because that's part of leadership, is to be able to rise above and rise through these moments of conflict and moments of criticism. But it doesn't mean you ever have to develop a desire for it or a fascination with it or even an affection for it. But if we pray, if we consult and we engage, we can navigate the source, the matter, and come up with a resolution in a way that preserves the bond of unity and the spirit of peace that Paul talks about and allows us to still thrive as spiritual leaders. So this has been the Spirit-Filled Leadership Podcast. As always, we invite you to share, to like, to consume in all the various ways that you can consume this podcast, and invite others to do the same. We're going to be back with you in a couple weeks with more content, but thank you for joining us today. And you know what? Yeah, this is good. Thanks for joining us. God bless you.
Come, take my hand. We'll dance on graves, raise the dead, heal all the lame, set them free, help them believe in the power of the one who sets them free.
In many ways, the work of a critic is easy. We risk very little, yet enjoy a position over those who offer up their work and themselves to our judgment. We thrive on negative criticism, which is fun to write and to read. But the bitter truth we critics must face is that in the grand scheme of things, the average piece of junk is probably more meaningful than our criticism designating it so.